I'd like to offer a few more things for you to consider about this topic that we didn't have a chance to cover in the interview or that came into my thinking as I was preparing for this and, frankly, while I was conducting the interview. So, one of the things that makes economics so fascinating to me, and global affairs for that matter, is how unpredictable it can be. And it's unpredictable because, well, there are people involved, and people are unpredictable. I don't know too many people with a deep academic background and a deep understanding of economic history and the history of geopolitics who would have predicted that when the United States initiated a tariff regime against most countries in the world, that there wouldn't be a significant retaliation from many of them. Taking aside the US-China trade spat, many of the countries around the world chose a cooler heads prevail mentality that they didn't see a benefit to their own country from raising significant barriers to U.S. trade. They would target selected industries that might send a message and maybe make a point, but didn't fundamentally retaliate with anything near what they were hit with. And the reason for this is because most of these countries determined that it wasn't in their interest to do so, that if the U.S. would pursue a tariff policy that potentially could even harm their own economy, why would they respond and retaliate with measures that would harm their own? Not many people believed that countries would be able to keep cooler heads and take this effectively broadside in stride and let it pass. There was also an underestimation of how quickly in the modern globalized world trade patterns could change very rapidly. That if a certain trade route or trade partner was cut off, that new trade partners would be able to replace them fairly quickly. And so we maybe should have learned that lesson after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Europe went from importing huge amounts of energy from Russia to effectively none in a fairly short period of time. Something that the Russians even would have thought was completely unthinkable, and they believed this would be a key point of leverage for them against Europe. The United States may have also had a belief that its trade relationships were so critical to nations around the world that they were an indispensable trade partner, and therefore that using trade as leverage would have been a more powerful tool than it really ended up being. You could use the example of China establishing much more trade on soybeans with Latin American countries like Brazil, doing that very quickly and being able to move past the potential damage done by having tariffs instituted on the soybean trade between the U.S. and China. So these issues, these topics can be very unpredictable because you just never know how governments and the individuals who run them are truly going to respond. But I will offer another important perspective. Those who have been advocates for a more protectionist economic policy, not just in the United States, but around the world, have often cited that it's too narrow to look at just trade policy and not understand how it fits into a much bigger and broader economic vision. That if you only looked at trade policy and tariff and non-tariff barrier policies, some of the things that countries do might seem silly if looked at in a vacuum. But that we have to consider all of the issues and all the factors that affect an economy, and then you may have a different perspective on the use of these economic tools. So I reflected a little bit on that. And it was an important point to consider that there are underlying trends that make a significant difference to the future of economies all over the world. So, for example, we know we've covered on this podcast extensively the demographic evolution of modern industrialized Western nations. We know the demographic collapse that has already happened in some countries. Japan gets covered a lot, but many of the countries of Western Europe, with aging populations, fewer children paying into those systems, and countries that are struggling to figure out how they're going to grow when they have so many aged people who are unable to contribute significantly to the workforce and so few young people that can support that. Also in an era of backlash against immigration, which in many places around the world had been the way that countries were able to fill that gap. So these demographic realities have economic realities, and the restricting of immigration around the world compounds many of them. But these are two realities that have to be understood that are impacting economic policy around the world and economic growth. We also can't ignore technology. It's very critical to understand how companies have become more efficient through the use of technology and the hopes, if not expectations, that artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and other advances that seem to be just around the corner may allow countries and individuals to be much more productive than they were in the past. And of course, productivity has a huge impact on economic growth. It could have a competitive impact on which countries can use these tools faster to make themselves more productive, even in an era of declining populations and minimal immigration. We don't fully understand how the technology will impact the economies of the world, but we hear trends that could go from relatively minor short-term productivity gains that allow countries to do more with fewer people to, let's call them, outlier scenarios where AI, robotics, quantum computing, and other technologies could replace half of the jobs that exist today. Not only replacing a gap because of a declining workforce, but actually starting to throw people into unemployment who would otherwise be working in these economies, completely changing the dynamics and the challenges facing countries. We can't ignore the fiscal realities of the world we live in. How much debt has been generated by governments around the world to fuel their spending? We can't ignore that there has been a significant increase in defense spending around the world, partially triggered by what's happened in the Middle East, but what's happened in Eastern Europe, the United States stepping back from its role as the police of the world, forcing countries to consider how they will defend themselves without the backstop of an American guarantee of their protection. We also can't ignore the energy revolution. Some countries around the world making significant advancements in solar and wind technology. The entire international community reflecting on how nuclear energy can and should be a bigger part of its future. The energy efficiency gains that have allowed oil and gas production to go further and to do more for us. And the increased energy needs that the new technologies like AI are requiring at the very moment that we're going through some of these energy changes and transitions. The truth is, none of us can predict how any one of these issues is going to impact the global economy. But now put all of these cross currents together, throw in trade policy on top of it, and truly, I don't think anybody has ever seen an era quite like this where they can draw a historical parallel and predict how it's all going to pan out. So, what questions am I asking myself if I keep in mind the topics of restricted immigration, of demographic collapse in some countries around the world, of increased fiscal spending and debt and defense spending, of the advent and the dawn of a new era of productivity technology, of an energy revolution that we are in the midst of, compounded with all of the trade topics that we've talked about today? Well, there's two things that are most concerning to me. Number one is the potential for war to break out at a larger scale than it already has. All of these changes we just talked about are going to affect societies and countries in profound ways that we don't fully understand. And in some cases, they may turn to conflict as an answer to how to address them, especially if we see some countries take huge leaps forward in their productivity gains, their technology gains, and it allows them to begin to rival old powers faster than we previously thought they could. We also can't underestimate how all this defense spending around the world, active conflicts, are going to dramatically increase the efficiency of weapon systems and reduce the cost of war from a technological standpoint. That may make it more likely and easier as countries see fewer costs to conducting those types of operations. So I am concerned about that and how countries of the world would change and respond as a result of a larger conflict than those we've already seen initiated in Europe. But the bigger thing that I have some deeper reflecting to do on is what is the impact of all of these things on innovation and entrepreneurship? Because these have been the drivers of growth throughout the Western world and, frankly, much of the world as a whole. And the key to innovation and entrepreneurship has often been collaboration, sharing of learned lessons around the world. Some great scientific advances couldn't have happened in just one country without the exchange of ideas across borders. It's also true that innovation comes from testing and learning in multiple places, exchanging ideas, and having the smartest people in the world be able to move around that world so that they can work with other great minds and experiment in different ways. So if we end up lifting all kinds, or I should say, debuting all kinds of new trade barriers, immigration barriers, and technological barriers that restrict the movement of people, it will also restrict the movement of ideas. It will also restrict the ability for those ideas to truly flourish and grow into commercially viable concepts, and that this could put a significant damper on entrepreneurship as a whole. That's a negative point of view, but there is a positive point of view. Because what if all of these challenges, what if forcing countries to look within themselves for their own talent, to force countries with limited resources that are getting thinned out by the day, forces them into productivity, forces them into innovation, requires people to elevate their thinking, and maybe technology that frees up more people's minds and hands to solve these problems rather than take care of the mundane activities of their daily life? What if all of this sparks an innovation and entrepreneurship revolution, forced by the dynamics of the environment around us, and maybe incentivized by the very policies that could disrupt it by disrupting the movements of people? I think that there is a chance that entrepreneurship could flourish in a way that it hasn't before if the AI productivity tools of the future free up more minds and more hands to focus on building something new and different and using these tools to create a new world that solves new challenges. And you never know where innovation is going to come from, but I will say innovation comes faster in countries under stress than it does from those who are able to coast by. So I don't know which way it's going to go, but I hope that by offering all of these different perspectives and variables, it offers you a more global view of how trade is just one of many pillars that fit into the future of your country and of your business, of your community, of your society, and how it could impact all of us for the positive or potentially for the negative. And I'd love to hear from you which you think is more likely and how you see it all playing out.